Very good evening to you all, and a very warm welcome to Kellogg College. My name is Juliet Carpenter. I'm Director of Research at the Global Centre on Healthcare and Urbanisation, GCHU. And we're delighted to welcome you to this very first seminar of the academic year. We hold them twice a term in week 1 and week 8, around the interest that GCHU has in 2 different overlapping areas of interest here within the Kellogg community. One is sustainable urban development, and the other is health and well-being, with links to primary care and evidence-based medicine. So we bring together in our research interests the sustainability lens with health and well-being and active travel, which is what we're going to be talking about today. So the format of the seminars is very informal. We have 4 speakers who will be giving a 5-minute response to a key question that we pose around our interests at GCHU. And today we're going to be discussing the critical issue of equity in cycling, and how more diverse communities can access cycling and other active travel modes. So in policy circles, active travel is often promoted as a win-win. It addresses sustainability goals, it addresses carbon reduction, as well as issues around health and well-being linked to both air quality and tackling obesity. So it's this overlapping between sustainability and health and well-being, which is really promoted in terms of active travel. But we suggest that the question of equity is really often sidelined in those policy debates. And so in tonight's session, we're asking a critical question about whether active travel can work for everyone, and how can cycling and other active travel modes be more accessible to a wider population. And I see a group of guests have just arrived, perhaps from one of the master's programs in sustainable urban development. So you're very welcome to come and join us. We're just introducing tonight's seminar. So do take a seat. Thank you for joining us. So this evening I'm delighted to welcome the 4 speakers here today who are going to encourage us to think critically about active travel, about equity in cycling, both in Oxford and beyond. And so I just briefly introduce the 4 speakers. So first up we have Professor Rachel Aldred, who is Professor of Transport at the University of Westminster and Director of the university's Active Travel Academy. And next we have Kate Ball, who is Campaigns and Policy Lead at Wheels for Wellbeing, which is an award-winning charity which campaigns for inclusive cycling. Following that, we're going to have Duncan Dollymore, who is Head of Campaigns at Cycling UK, which is a charity that campaigns locally and nationally to support cycling and promote a safe and easy choice that cycling could be. And finally, we have Hassan Sabri, who is Director of Oxford Community Action, which is a local charity here in Oxford, working to promote community development and social inclusion, particularly for diverse, multi-ethnic communities. And Hassan's been instrumental in setting up a bike scheme for communities who don't normally have access to cycling, particularly for children who can't access cycling as a means of getting around. So Hassan's going to be telling us a little bit about that local project that's going on here in Oxford. So we'll have the 4 short presentations and then open up to the floor for a discussion, question and answer with the panel. So without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Rachel. Thanks very much.
Yep, how's that? Good. Excellent. Thank you. So I'm going to time myself because 5 minutes is really short, and I apologise
for only scratching the surface of a lot of stuff, but I'm sure in the discussion we'll be able to spend more time on this and hear from the audience as well. So just a reflection based on what Juliet said, the win-win thing I find really interesting, because often cycling and active travel are framed around carbon reduction. But if you think about using cycling and other sustainable transport modes for carbon reduction, the focus would be getting people out of cars. Now, who disproportionately drives cars? It's white, better off, non-disabled men, right? But if we want to think about cycling and other sustainable transport modes in terms of, say, health, social, economic benefits and so on, potentially we're looking at a different group there. We're not so much looking at getting people out of cars. We're looking perhaps at expanding people's choices, at getting people to make journeys who maybe currently aren't making that many journeys. So I think sort of teasing apart the win-win is really important, and thinking about whose journeys, what benefits and so on we're actually focusing on. Second thing I wanted to say is cycling is very unequal in the UK, as people may well be aware. So around 3/4 of regular cyclists are men. There's an ethnicity gap that's pretty much similar size to the gender gap, but very much less talked about. Obviously, there are big differences between different communities, but overall, if we compare white people and non-white people, the gap is similar to the gap between men and women in terms of cycling. There are big inequalities around disability, there are big inequalities around age. But this is not natural. Often it's been assumed that it is. None of these things are natural. These gaps vary by context. In places where there's more cycling, there are no gaps or fewer gaps, or the gaps are reversed. So if you look at contexts across the world with more cycling, you'll find that, you know, in the Netherlands and Japan, for instance, women cycle more than men. Cycling is much more age equal. In fact, if we were talking about cycling inequalities in the Netherlands around age and gender, we might be talking about why 30-year-old men are not cycling more. So these things vary so much by context. Even where those gaps don't always disappear in UK and other contexts, they're still much reduced. And I don't think there's a kind of natural level for cycling. It varies so much. So for instance, across the UK, only around 2% of disabled commuters cycle to work. In Cambridge, where cycling levels are even higher than in Oxford, 25% of disabled commuters cycle to work. That's still lower than the average of 33%, but it's very much higher than 2%. And we see similar things, say, if we look at the Netherlands, and gender and ethnicity gaps in the Netherlands. So ethnic minority Dutch women cycle less than white Dutch men, but very much more than white English men. So, you know, these things are socially constructed. And we need to think about multiple entangled barriers, I think. So, for instance, if we build for the commute, we build for some people's trips more than other people's trips. If you look at the trips that women do compared to trips that men do, there's much more combining of purposes. There's much more dropping off kids before going to work, for instance. So if you just build for the A to B commute, you know, you're building for some people's trips, and not even, you know, even a minority of their trips. You're not building for the people who don't have a job, who don't commute to work and so on. We also need to look at sort of barriers faced by specific groups, and there's been increasing awareness of barriers around social safety, for instance, that if you build cycle routes that, okay, they're maybe away from traffic, but they're through badly lit estates, badly lit parks that are dark at night, you know, particularly women will be put off using them. So there's some kind of progress. I think there's increasing recognition of the gender gap, of barriers particularly faced by women, but there's still a long way to go around many of the other gaps. So, for instance, a paper that I co-authored with Akwesi Osei looked at barriers to black men cycling in London. And this is an area where there's so little research, despite the fact that London, you know, 50% of Londoners are not white. If you're going to get mass cycling in London, then it really has to diversify in a whole range of ways. And many of those barriers that these men faced are not seen as mainstream barriers to cycling. They're not taken as seriously as barriers that are maybe more typically faced by white men. And the title of the paper came from a quote from one of the interviewees. You always think about what other people be thinking. And as well as that being use of the subjunctive, which I always admire, it is also highlighting the fact that the cultural, the policy, the infrastructural barriers are all entangled. And many of these men thought that cycling infrastructure in diverse areas of London was worse than in less diverse areas. But we don't know because no one's done that research. There was more I wanted to say, but that's 5 minutes, so we shall come back to it, I'm sure. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Rachel. Thanks a lot for those insights, those broad level insights. Now we're going to ask Kate to give her perspective on cycling and equity.
Hi, so I was the one who ended up bringing the slides. Do I need to hold the microphone? There we are, this means I can avoid using my teacher voice. So I've brought the slides along, and I just first off wanted to alter the title a little bit to fit in a bit more with what we do at Wheels for Wellbeing, trying to get that equity into cycling and active travel as a whole. So I really wanted to talk about walking, wheeling and cycling in cities, and can active travel combined with public transport work for most people for many journeys. It's really not very snappy said like that, but actually cycling can work for loads and loads of people, but it's not suitable for everybody or anybody for every journey. We need to have other options available, especially walking and wheeling, and a lot of people need public transport too, especially if we're going into things like the 15-minute cities concept, where 15 minutes isn't 15 minutes if you're a disabled person with a walking speed well under half the speed that you are expected to go by our infrastructure designers. So we need to have that breadth in what we're considering. So within that, thinking about what active travel really means. And when we're talking about active travel, we're talking about ordinary, everyday utility trips or journeys being made in ways that include physical activity. So for disabled people, that includes powered mobility. So it includes an electric wheelchair, it includes a mobility scooter, it includes an e-scooter. We need more diversity in what is allowed in terms of mobility. So from being able to use your hand cycle legally on a footway, which you currently cannot, being able to use your recumbent cycle legally on a footway, or your tandem legally on a footway at walking speed, which currently you cannot, to not being frowned upon for being lazy if you're a larger person using a mobility scooter because you are a disabled person and you need that to get around, so not being sneered at for your options that you're using that are low carbon, that are enabling you to get around your home in a way that works for you. So we need that breadth being permitted socially. How do we actually achieve getting accessible active travel? Unfortunately, we have a bit of a blip in the animation. You can't see the tricyclist. He's ended up behind a square on the picture by the looks of it. But how do we make the accessible travel, how do we make active travel inclusive and accessible? And we hear the same things happening over and over again. You just have to imagine on that lovely blue cycle lane, there is a tricyclist up there. But if you look next to the cycle lane, there's a footway that's very steeply sloped. So we've got some examples of some nice accessible infrastructure for the cyclists, but the people walking and wheeling along that footway are going to struggle. They're going to be sliding down into the roadway, which isn't so great. So infrastructure is the first thing that we hear about all the time for walking, wheeling and cycling. I left nearly an hour to get half a mile from where I'm staying tonight to get up to here because I did not know what the infrastructure was going to be like, and I did end up wheeling down 2 carriageways because the footways were not usable. So the basics of ensuring routes are usable and that we have suitable parking and storage for cycles and every other mobility aid. It doesn't matter how good the routes are. What we hear from a lot of people is if they live in a terraced house and there's no on-street secure cycle parking, they cannot cycle if they're not able to lift their cycle into their house. If you're one person in that house, that might be fine. If you're a family of 5, now you don't have a living room or a kitchen because it's full of bicycles. If you need larger cycles, really forget it. And that's where you get onto the equipment, the sheer cost of equipment, how to make that reasonable for everybody. It's in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of People with Disabilities, the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, UNCRPD, that there should be access at a reasonable cost to suitable mobility aids to make journeys every day for every person. That currently isn't happening. We need availability of the devices. You need to be able to test them out. You need to be able to work out what works for you at different stages in your life and when you have different needs of getting around. And we need maintenance. We need breakdown services. If you get a puncture and you're a non-disabled cyclist, you can push your bike home. What exactly do you do if it's your hand cycle, you can't walk and something's gone wrong? You need an option to be able to get rescued easily. And you need opportunities to work all of this out. And that means we need attitudes to change as well. And very much in line with what Rachel was just saying, in our work we prioritise mobility justice. That means we're not looking for mode shift, we're looking for resources to go towards people who currently don't have the opportunities. And intersectional disadvantage is a huge issue there. So people with more than one protected characteristic needing to have the vast bulk of current resources directed towards meeting their needs, which are currently the ones that are most underserved. Thank you very much. And I think I'm just about 5 minutes as well.
Great, thank you for keeping to time, both of you. So now we have Duncan Dollymore from Cycling UK.
Good evening, everyone. I agree with everything that the two previous speakers have said, but the pitch question was, can active travel work for everyone? And I think the answer depends upon whether you look at this on an individual basis or a societal basis. This might fall really flat, but I completely rewrote this pitch a couple of hours ago, travelling by train down from Manchester. So I hope this works. I'd been there to do an interview this morning with BBC Breakfast. They called yesterday, and there was an interview scheduled which was potentially framed as one of those controversial ones. It was about bus stop bypasses. Some of you will know a little bit about these, but that's when you have a continuous cycle lane on a route which also is used for buses, and you have to do something at the bus stop. And the procedure that's used in many European countries is you take the bus stop around the back, so they take the cycle lane around the back of the bus stop. I won't go into too many details. Short story, we haven't implemented them very well sometimes in the UK, and they've caused some issues. But the media do like to frame it as an issue where it's a benefit for cyclists, which is horrible for people with disabilities, including those who are visually impaired. And it's thrown as a bit of a controversial issue. So I had to deal with that this morning. And in dealing with it, I was having those questions thrown at me about, is this something that works for you, but it doesn't work for somebody who's visually impaired? And it got me thinking about lots of those whataboutery questions that are posed in relation to cycling. So somebody will say to you, but what about those that are less fit or older? How does it work? They can't cycle, and you mention e-bikes to them and the introduction there. And then somebody says to you, but what about people with disabilities? And you mention the fantastic work of organisations like Wheels for Wellbeing and the availability of adapted bikes. But what about those people who need to carry luggage and things? And you mentioned cargo bikes and people taking their kids to school on adapted cycles. And then you know you've won the argument when somebody says, but what about the weather? Because you're thinking of Holland and that fantastic place where it never rains, but somehow people still cycle. But it's relevant to this conversation because it got me thinking about how you look at this question of, can active travel work for everyone? Because it depends whether you also look at alternatives and consequence. Because what you actually need to think about is, where would we be if some of those people who are cycling were not cycling? So if I choose not to cycle to the train station and I drive instead, I'm taking up more road space, I'm contributing to congestion, I'm contributing to air pollution. There's lots of things that I'm contributing to that have a societal impact. And I was thinking about that in connection with the interview this morning, which was put in my diary because it's an issue in London. So London is the city which has actually put the infrastructure in, including those controversial bus stop bypasses that have enabled cycling to boom. So we now have 1.26 million cycling journeys a day in London. If somebody had said that to you 15 years ago, you'd have thought, that's impossible, it's never going to happen. And 70% of the people travelling over Blackfriars Bridge in the morning are occupying 20% of the road space on a cycle lane. And just imagine if they didn't. Just imagine if instead some or all of those were taking that journey by car. That would have huge and massive societal implications for everybody. London would grind to a halt. The pollution would be horrific. There would be serious public health consequences. So I would tentatively suggest to you, whilst accepting everything that's been said and agreeing with everything on an individual basis, there is an argument for saying that active travel is already working for everybody and can work for everybody, because even if it's current level and current distribution, if it didn't take place, the societal consequences would be huge. And we have to look at that in the conversation. And it doesn't mean we don't need to consider the issues around diversity and equity. We do and we must. But we do need to take these conversations looking around the broader issue of consequences and alternatives in relation to those issues, because sometimes cycling is presented as a problem. And it was presented as a problem to me in an interview this morning without anybody factoring out the advantages and what's enabled 1.26 million people to travel daily in London by bike. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Duncan. Thank you for that. And Hassan, yeah, if you'd like to take the floor.
Yeah. Just on behalf of OCA, Oxford Community Action, I think two of my other directors are there. For us, our journey started 2022. And Active Oxfordshire County Council came to us and asking us whether we can help them questionnaire or survey in Blackbellies how people travel in by bike or the roads. And when they came to us, like we started, me and my other colleague, questionnaires that were helped from Oxford Brookes, as in a small 10 question asked the people how do you go to active travel and how you cycle in the area that Blackbellies where you live. And we found it out that majority of the people we asked, they were like, some of them were saying the area they live in, it doesn't have a good road of cycling. People were saying like, I don't have a bike and I don't go to those kind of places. And to us as a small organization in a local, we realized that, wait a minute, we can see a lot of majority of the people that we talking to them don't even engage for that kind of exercise or that kind of cycling bike. And then when we go back to that county council and we say we're really interested in this to know more about why this kind of groups are not cycling and are not be part of that. And it took us like, I think for me, it's a 2022, when we started, we thought, okay, let's go too deep and find out the families, the children, the mothers, the dads, whether they're really interested to be part. If some of them said the schools, even though here the schools runs a bikeability for every child, one is the age of 5 years to 8. Some of the schools that might be the teacher doesn't, the head teacher will not take that chance to become a bikeability. Then the kids, when they grow up, they miss that training on to become an understanding by cycling. Then there's a lot of questions when you ask, they will not put their hand up and said, oh, I know how to cycle. They will just put it and said, oh, I never ride a bike. And then it took us as a small organization said, we need to help, we need to do something and make it like this is accessible for everybody. And I think the first time when we did a cycling from Blackbellies, we invited them, Professor Alex Bett in the University Global to come and ride with us and see the amount of the kids that want to come and ride Blackbellies to town. And we were like 58 children all turn up, and then with an adult we had. And since that 2022 to now, if I can tell you that how many, as in a small organization in a local, that we've been donating nearly 300 bikes, but then 198 went within 2-3 weeks when people just said, can I have a bike, a second hand? Because then we find it out again, not only because they don't ride it again, even if they ride it, the cost of getting in a bike. And now I'm very happy to say that this is like our organization now. We got like a majority, we have a place, we have a mechanic, a local mechanic that now has qualified, who's got certificate that can help the community if they need. We're now having more mothers and more dads come to us openly and said, oh, my child is 16 or 12 or 13 and he doesn't know how to ride. Then can we help? And then we partner with Aventis, Psychability, and the groups within the local who can come to us and say we can help them if they need it. Then as a small organization, we find that not only the first time I took it 23 children, I took it a bike ride it's called Bike Oxford. And it was 700 people was riding that day. And we were the only 23 of us as a diverse people to be on that group. And the children, they feel happy to be part of this 13 miles from the local to do it. But then my question has always been asked, like, is this not the people stopping us, but is an opportunity is not there, or the information is not reaching out for those kids to give a confidence to say, like, you can be part of these people who are already cycling. You can become a saint and learn about it. And us, we only open that gate at the moment, and hopefully in 5 years' time we might see a lot of young people who really ride in the city and just enjoying to go to school by school. And I find sometimes the mother come to me in the street and said, thank you for guys, as in a small organization, I don't take my child to school anymore because the kids take a bike to school. And that is one of our team did it. But to be honest, it's really, I since now to 2020 now, 23, 24, for me, I became a cyclist. I love going around with all the time my own bikes and in the city. And that before, I didn't even go to the bike, even myself. I never even want to ride a bike, but now I feel safer. I always encourage people to come, and that's all I can say. But I think definitely there's a lot of work to do, and I think it's a more and openly like diverse. It's not, even if you look around at all the organizations that we work with and the cities, and you can see it, it's still, even though the population is 35%, I think in Oxford are diverse communities in there, but it's still, when you look the psychability side of them, we're not that far, we're not there. And we will take, that's all my 5 minutes, thank you.
Great, well thanks so much all four of you for some really fascinating insights and great stories and storytelling, taking us through the journeys that you've been on. So many thanks for that. And now I'd really like to open it up to the floor. We've got a roving mic, so if anyone has any questions either to one of the panelists or the whole panel, do fire away any questions that you may have. Yeah, just at the back there. And if you could just say your name and any affiliation you have.
Sure. Hi, I'm at University of Oxford. Thank you all for really fascinating and inspiring presentations. Question for Hassan. You were talking a lot about getting community in Blackbird Lee cycling, and you said right at the end about you didn't used to cycle and now you did. I just would like to sort of hear more about that in terms of, I think it's so interesting looking at our own behaviours when we're thinking about sort of changing other people. So for you, what was stopping you cycling and what got you started cycling, do you think?
To me was beginning. I was a footballer, so I'm physical healthy. That kind of side of them, I always thought it's not safe to be on the road because I was always scared about the cars around speedily in the road, and never came to me. And even though I always wanted to do something like this, but then again, originally where I came from, Somalia, cycling is not an option for me in the country that I was, because the road instructors everywhere. But in here, I think thanks to Steve is here in the ground, psychability. Yes, he put his hands. That's the people who encouraged me to cycle, and because I went to do volunteer for them and take a lot of children in OCA to go there summer holiday activities, and then we always go there and we feel safe because it's a place where it's locked, it's not on a road, and it's everybody who doesn't even know how to cycle feels safer to learn. And then the majority of the people were used to go there 2 hours every Thursday or Friday, and then everyone hooked it because then they feel safe to ride a bike, and then we went to the street.
Great. Yeah, in the middle here.
Thank you very much. I'm Nicola. I'm also a student here at the university and at Kellogg, actually. And my question is also for Hassan. You were talking about how your organization focuses on getting children involved in cycling. So I was wondering if you also had projects targeting the parents or working age adults. or whether you had seen perhaps a knock-on effect of, through the children getting involved in cycling, the parents also getting more inspired to do it as well. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's what we want to encourage, because for me now we open a club called every Sunday, 1 o'clock to 3 is open to everybody. But what we are targeting now is if the mother or the dad engage and become a cyclist, then the whole family will go together with on their bike. But then the question is like, how did I, because some of the parents never tried, some of them never ride it. Like my youngest rider is here on my club, is 7 years old. And I bring it today here, but this is what we're doing. It definitely, I have more fathers who put in their hand up and say, yeah, I want to learn, I want to do it. And now I became an instructor myself, then I can help them more to teach them in their own space, their own place. But definitely, my goal is to target the family, the mom, because the kids is okay, it's fun, it's easy. If you engage them, there will be. But the mothers and dad, if they understand the benefit, not only just the health benefit they can get on, the easy way to go around. The transport now is expensive in our city, and if they really understand how much they can save to go around a normal, then that's what we're doing. And I think we've got like more adults now trained by level 1, level 2, level 3. Then the more we got, we definitely want to encourage dad and mums to cycle.
Yeah, we've got a question here.
Thank you, everybody. My question really relates to safety. I'm concerned that the roads aren't really safe, and which I'm sure everybody's experienced, but does anybody engage with highways contractors during roadworks, which aren't always very temporary, they're very long term sometimes, because cyclists are, and I'm sure people with mobility aids are completely abandoned during roadworks.
Would anyone like to?
This is something that we do work on as temporary works, so we've got guide sheets on temporary works as well. So safety at street works and roadworks is the main guidance, statutory guidance for contractors, and so you can challenge any provision that doesn't meet those standards. There's supposed to be a new version coming out quite soon. We're not totally sure who's actually consulted on it. Nobody who we would have thought should have has, so we're trying to work on that at the moment. But there are basic minimum standards that should provide for all people walking and wheeling. They're not great on cycling. And then there's also London guidance specifically for cycling provision at roadworks. And we do engage with contractors. So we've had a lot of success at, for example, Hammersmith Bridge and some other bridges. And we've tried it with the Botley Bridge roadworks in Oxford as well, but I'm not sure they've actually enacted it at the moment, to ensure that marshalling schemes permit disabled cyclists to use the footways without having to dismount very slowly, so at walking speed only, so that the access is retained, and ensuring that suitable diversions that are accessible, that are protected and sufficiently safe under the National Cycle Guidance LTM 120 criteria are maintained as well. So it needs working on, but there are standards. They are better than most of the other standards that are around. They're just not implemented sufficiently.
You want to ask one? No, fine. Okay. Yeah, just at the back there.
Hi, I'm Keith Watson. I'm doing the SUD and a member of Kellogg. So I'm relatively unfamiliar with Oxford as a city, and as part of it, one of the exercises we were assigned to do to sort of analyse it, and then I used my bike to explore. But one of the observations was, in terms of accessibility for everyone, is sort of the permeability of the city. And if you want to get from A to B, you have to go way around these large parcels of land, which are maybe a school estate or a college, or they have particular rules if you want to cross it, that you can't cycle. So I just wonder, cyclists' experience of that, and if there's any moves within the city to try and open up access in that perspective for everyone.
Sure. Anyone want to? Yeah.
I can't answer that in terms of specific proposals or moves in Oxford. And I don't know Oxford that well, but your description matches my experience of every time I've been here and jumped on a Brompton or tried to ride somewhere. I seem to have been going around a very long way around to get to wherever I want to be. Not that I've done it loads, but every time I've tried, it's felt like that. So I can sort of sign on to your experience, and that experience is directly contrary to what all the guidance is, because the guidance is very clear that what cyclists need, or what people who are riding need, are direct routes. Because if you take people on a circuitous journey that doesn't go from A to B or goes from A to B via C, D, E, and F, people won't take it. It doesn't encourage people, doesn't enable people to do them, and so those routes are directly in contravention of the guidance as to what's supposed to happen with network planning. I know that's not a real helpful answer in terms of what's happening in Oxford. I'm not really sure how that's being addressed, but it should be addressed, and it should be raised effectively with the council, because that's an issue which is not how it's supposed to be. Because what's supposed to happen is it's direct routes, because we know that people don't take them. And a lot of those routes are also particularly difficult for women, because as soon as you start those circuitous routes, you're going around the back of places that aren't lit, you're going to places where women don't want to be, and that further discourages people from taking up cycling.
Just very quickly, there's another equity point on that too. So as part of the propensity to cycle tool for Department for Transport that I worked on with some colleagues, we produce what are called distance decay functions that show that as distance increases, people get less likely to cycle, right? But those distance decay functions are sharper for women and older people. So if routes are unnecessarily detouring, that disproportionately puts off women and older people from cycling.
Thanks. Yeah, we've had just a question at the front here. Been waiting for a while.
Thank you. Hello, yes, I'm Oliver. I'm one of the doctoral students here in Sustainable Urban Development. I'm going to briefly touch on someone else's research, if I'm allowed to, since it's not my own, and then I have a segue onto a question. But the comment, or at least someone else on our cohort is researching female cycling in Japan, because I think Japan is often lauded as this very high number of women cyclists. What she's finding is that it's not quite the kind of feminist good news story that you might think, and actually there's kind of sexist reasons that are almost pushing women onto bicycles, and I just wanted to share that to champion someone who seems to be doing some quite cool stuff. And the segue is onto, I suppose, this gender gap and this ethnicity gap that sort of has come out. And as we move towards kind of active travel for everyone and closing that gap, do we view this as and I'm getting the sense, but the extent to which we view this as like an intersectional problem, or are there ways that we can move from this white man typically dominated cycling inequity towards that everyone? How do we get from where we are to there most effectively, I suppose?
Who'd like to?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, obviously, very big question. I mean, I'm kind of glad that the debate has, to some extent, I think, shifted from an assumption that if we get more cycling, it will automatically become more equal. And obviously, we do need more cycling, but we also need a focus on, the barriers that have traditionally, as I suggested earlier, I think, been disregarded because they don't maybe affect, white non-disabled men cycling as much as other groups. So I think a rethinking of centralising of some of those barriers is really important, and I think that's happened to some extent around gender. So I think when you look at the way that cycling level of service assessments has changed, and the fact that they include traffic safety, they also include social safety, and so on, and perceptions of safety, which are all really important, and perhaps particularly important for women. So taking all those wider issues, not seeing, for instance, the specific barriers facing disabled people cycling as some kind of an add-on, but seeing them as really crucial to getting more people cycling. And I think getting a more diverse planning workforce also is really important. I'm reminded of the anecdote where some Transport for London planners, who happen to be women, managed to stop Andrew Gilligan, who's then the Mayor's Cycling Commissioner, of putting a main cycling route through an unlit estate road, which were just going to be completely impassable after dark for them. And he hadn't realised that this, for many other people, would be a complete barrier to cycling. And I think that's one reason why gender has got more consideration in London cycling planning, is the fact that the TfL cycling workforce is more diverse in that regard, but not so much in others.
Yes, completely agree with everything Rachel said. If you don't have infrastructure which looks and feels safe for women, what you will have is a cohort of people cycling that looks and feels like very confident lycra cyclists, people who were doing it regardless of those safety perceptions. It's what we had in London 15 years ago. And if you go in London now and stand by the embankment with the cycle superhighway, it looks pretty mixed. It looks quite a diverse group of people cycling up and down. And it's the infrastructure that's done that. But it's not just creating a safe route. It's the routes going to the right places. We have a problem in the UK with transport planning being male dominated, and therefore lots of the routes are designed where men think people want to go. It's that whole cities designed by men concept, and we don't think about the journeys that women want to make. There's a fantastic group called Women in Transport who are doing a huge amount of work in relation to that, but it's shifting that mindset to the trips that people want to make or need to make, and designing your planning on your routes with that in mind.
Great. There was a question right at the back. I don't know if you've still got a question, but I noticed a hand had gone up.
Thank you, Chris Pugh. I'm the Sustainability Fellow of Kellogg College. I'm just be interested to hear the response of our first two speakers to the construct that Duncan proposed about the sort of secondary gain benefits, and where that takes us in terms of sort of tipping points and making life easier for everybody.
I think it's a really important point. It's one that we end up raising a lot. So we do quite a lot of work reviewing highway schemes and development of schemes, and promote the idea that if you're removing parking spaces, you should increase blue badge parking simultaneously. You should be ensuring that the people who need to drive still can, and that encouraging a majority of people, enabling a majority of people to use active travel and public transport means that those who still need to drive are better able to do so. You get that benefit. That even if you're not able to cycle, having more people cycling reduces air pollution and noise pollution in your area, which has massive health benefits. It means you're less likely to be run over. And it's worth noting that if you are a disabled person, you are massively more likely to be killed or seriously injured by a driver than if you are non-disabled. So anything that reduces driven miles, provided it still enables the necessary journeys and the desired journeys for people who do not have other options to make in cars, is really beneficial. So absolutely agree.
Yeah, totally agree with Kate, but just to add as well, that Transport for London did some really interesting research some while back that was never sadly published, but it looked at the kind of journeys that the general public thought should be prioritised by car. And generally, you know, what car journeys should we be prioritising if not all car journeys can be made? And people generally thought it was disabled people's trips, and trips taking children to hospital were the ones that we should prioritise. And that is absolutely not how our transport models and our transport appraisal prioritises trips, which instead tend to prioritise like business people's travel, for instance, which, when the general public are asked about whose trips to prioritise, that is not whose trips they say should be prioritised.
Yeah, we've got some questions down here. Should we take that one? Sorry, that one at the back. Yeah, that one. Yeah, brilliant.
Hello, I'm Khalid Hajbakri from DPhil program, just joined. I had this question about as we transfer into accepting cycling as a common mode of transport, we should also look into the impacts on pedestrians, people who walk. So the spatial arrangement of a street need to be redesigned in a way that everybody is still safe. And in most of the cases, I come from Dubai, in most of the cases, the design, the street design, the street layout isn't changing. And most of the, let's say, cyclers do the activity on the pedestrian space. So I don't know how you guys are theorizing for that. I mean, this should be a very huge impact on our streetscape, and if we are taking cycling seriously, then we should see that. That's what I thought.
Yeah, anyone like to respond to that?
I could just briefly, yeah, we don't. I don't think any of us would advocate putting cyclists on the pedestrian area. That, you know, we need to create more space for cycling, but we need to create more space for walking too. And space for cycling should come from space for driving. And traditionally in this country, the approach to providing space for cycling was to draw a cycle symbol on the road or on the footway, and that doesn't really make anyone happy. And I'm pleased to see that in London, the expansion of cycling infrastructure has largely come from space for cars. So the embankment cycleway, they removed lanes of motor traffic in order to create that. There was no reduction of pedestrian space, for instance. So yeah, it should be. And that is a way, as you say, of ensuring that people benefit more widely, reducing the space for cars when you create space for cycling or indeed walking.
Then there was another question. Did you have a question? Yeah.
Yes. I wish I could ask as many questions as I want to. But one of the questions I have, being recently new, very new to here to the UK, what have the main difference been between the policies or the different actions that have been taken in London that has become a more cycle-friendly city than to the rest of the UK, which my feeling it is not catching up to the same rate as it is in London? What is it missing in the rest of the cities? And what happened in London that enabled that move?
2 words: political will. It really is as simple as that. Parking your politics in terms of everything else about politics, London has had mayors from both political stripes who have actually been quite positive about active travel and cycling. They haven't done everything perfectly, but they have had mayors who have wanted to actually achieve something and put people in place to try and do that. And so it has been political will. And it's been, not everything's been perfect. There have been mistakes that have been made, but there has been a commitment to put in place the infrastructure. And there's been a commitment to take some bold decisions. And that's made the difference. Whereas in other places in the UK, we've had at times a lot of aspirational visions, a lot of documents which sound very good, but they don't come with a budget and they don't come with a delivery plan. That's not entirely the case everywhere. Wales, for example, put in some bold steps in relation to things around active travel, including reducing speed limits as a default basis, and also reviewing their roads programmes. So there have been other commitments, but the big difference in London has been political will. And we're sort of seeing that working to a certain extent where there are devolved powers in England for the metro mayoral areas. We're seeing more progress, for example, I think in Greater Manchester than we are in most councils. And it's that ability to drive things forward, I think, that's made a difference.
Just wanted to add a couple. I mean, this is a really fascinating topic, but a couple of quick things. It's also about the funding and the longer term funding, because London has to some extent been protected from the curse of short term competitive funding to some extent. And that's really hard. It's really hard to make ambitious streetscape changes if you're constantly chasing 1 year funding pots that none of them kind of line up with each other for different purposes and so on. That's so hard for local authorities. But also, I would like to maybe not give Boris Johnson quite so much credit. I mean, there was a lot of advocacy happened in London. There were a lot of protest around the 2012 election. There was a really interesting group called Londoners on Bikes that talked about making cycling a political issue in the election, as in vote with your bike. And there was some really, anyway, I've written about this stuff. It's really interesting stuff going on. And the fact that cycling, that transport was something in the mayor's gift. And, you know, there wasn't that much, you know, that was one of the main things, transport, that the mayor controlled. So it could become a big political issue in that regard. And I'll stop there because I could go on.
Did you have a question?
Thank you. I'm Matthew Ledbury. I've worked in transport for some years, most recently as a policy advisor for Como UK, which is the body that promotes shared transport in the UK, which is where I'm coming from with this question, because one of the features, one of the things about bike ownership that I think is a particular problem, there's 3 of them, is firstly the cost of ownership, secondly the storage, and thirdly the problem of theft. And certainly those first 2 have been touched on already. one of the ways of tackling this and making it more accessible generally, which is done in a lot of mainland European countries now, is through bike share schemes, street bike hire schemes, preferably docked ones rather than dockless. But their growth in the UK has still been very patchy, and there's large cities where this doesn't exist at all. I'd be interested for your views on whether there should be a concerted effort to make sure that all cities of a reasonable size, say over 100,000 people, should have a scheme like that as a way of ensuring that cycling is there for anyone who wants to do it.
Short answer is yes. I'm sometimes criticised or upset members of the organisation that I work for in relation to an issue around bikes on trains, because lots of cyclists want there to be complete lack of restriction on taking bikes on trains. We don't have the rail capacity for 90 people to put their bikes on their trains. I wish we did, but we don't. And so, whilst I would like there to be more space for people to take their bikes on trains, the answer in relation to transport is actually for people to get off the train and be able to get on a bike. And so, bike share schemes linked with those mobility hubs are essential in cities, because that's what people need. And you're right about European countries. You almost take it as a given in many of those European cities that there will be some system that you can use. And there are huge black spots across the UK with very large cities where there's either no scheme or, to be frank, it's a substandard scheme, and that doesn't support the take-up of cycling.
So I'd just like to add an extra bit for that. So obviously, if you are a disabled person, you might well need to use a specific cycle. It will be suited to you. And so absolutely, we will support the rollout for many people for share schemes. And they're a really great idea, as long as the parking bays are clearly demarcated and there is enforcement of cycles and cars not parking on footways. So making sure that infrastructure stays accessible, and obviously that's becoming a bit of a political football at the moment, but a lot of organisations are working very hard on that. But we do need a proper equitable rollout of suitable cycle options and suitable cycle storage for people who cannot, or it's unreasonably difficult for them to use hire schemes. And we need hire schemes to have more diverse cycle options, so having child seats on the back and further options that actually work for a broader range of people.
Yep, we've got a question here.
Hello, Angela from the DEFIL in Sustainable Urban Development. So in following with these shared schemes, shared bikes, so I mean I've experienced, I used to live in Barcelona. There was a very successful change from a shared scheme, right? And then similar things happened in London, right? It started and then it kind of, it was a very successful. I currently live in Cardiff, where I've been living for the past 15 years. And in that time, I have seen at least three attempts to have a shared bike scheme that started and died. The last time they claim it was down to thefts, and you know, obviously it's private companies. So what do you have a sense of what are the differences between the success stories, and is it a question of size of the city? Is it a question, like, do you have a sense of what can be the difference between success and failing of those schemes?
If I think of those cities I've got a hire bike in where the system hasn't worked, one of the most common problems is the lack of docking stations. So you can't actually dock your bike anywhere near where you're wanting to go. I've been in some cities. I've been in Belfast and got on a dockless hire bike and tried to ride to where I want to go, and then I've had to dock it so far away from where I want to be that I might as well walk the thing in the first place. And you don't get that so much in London. You can usually find a docking station pretty near where you want to go. So I think that's to do with the scale of the scheme. They need to have a certain scale about them and a number of docking stations for it to work. Otherwise, the stations are not convenient for people. And you do also need to have that confidence that you're going to get on a bike that's reasonably maintained and fit for purpose. And there have been schemes in the UK where you're pretty sure that you're going to pick up the bike and it will be a bit battered and bruised, and that doesn't really entice you to use it.
So this one would be something that we've been thinking about, but I get personal perspective rather than an organisational perspective. I'm from Derby, which has just lost its second e-bike hire scheme due to vandalism. And we've been discussing and wondering if some of this is the ratio between journeys that are made successfully, so that people are paying for, and the level of vandalism, rather than the absolute level of vandalism. So just Lime, which is obviously a very well-regarded scheme, was in Derby until very recently. Just after they put all their cycles into the city, the only cross-city cycle route was cut and is going to be closed for the best part of 2 years. So we suspect they haven't been able to hire out the bikes very often, but the bikes have been set on fire and dumped in the river. So probably the amount of money they've been making relative to the amount of money they've been losing doesn't make it a viable proposition. Maybe if the cycle infrastructure were there as well, the scheme could become more viable.
One last question here. Yeah. Matthew here. Yeah.
Matthew Hardy from the King's Foundation and involved in teaching this. I'd like to ask you the question that I asked my students today after talking about active travel. Given we need to make a transition very quickly to decarbonise transport, but we have a massive path dependency in the infrastructure, car-dependent infrastructure we've built for the last 70 years. How can we bust out of the dependency of the infrastructure that we've created and actually trigger a revolution in active travel? Is there an answer?
I mean, this is a nice question for us all to answer, perhaps, but I'll just start. So some of the research that I've been involved in London, looking at the impact of ambitious active travel interventions, I sort of found that, where you do really ambitious stuff, primarily like low traffic neighbourhoods with new cycle routes, you do get a measurable and quite quick change. You get a change in walking, cycling. It looks like you're also getting a reduction in driving and or car ownership. One of the problems is the sort of trade-off between impact and acceptability, right? That, if you do something that has an impact, it disrupts how people get around, and none of us initially like being disrupted, but ultimately, the disruption is what changes how people get around and how people think about their local area. The need, one of the other things is that is in London, as I think Kate alluded to as well, the importance of having public transport, the importance of having a range of options so that people are not solely dependent on their car and then expected to use active travel, that they also have those public transport options as well, I think. I guess it's doing it all quickly, but we have seen changes. We have seen changes in London in particular that are quite quick, so that is heartening at least.
We would say something very similar, but it's again, we need the rollout of the interventions that are not significantly harmful, but that cause a big benefit very, very fast, and then well-designed implementation of things like modal filters to create low traffic neighbourhoods. So we've seen 20 mile an hour rolled out in Wales. We've seen pavement parking bans rolled out in Scotland. Why don't we have those nationally? And why aren't they being enforced nationally? Because they can make areas much, much safer to use very, very fast. We can see cycle lanes going in on carriageways that are plenty wide enough to take that very easily and very quickly to enable bigger networks to be created. And we need to see that happening rapidly.
It's a long list of things that I would like national and local government to do which cost money. And we all know that those things perhaps take a bit of time to shift budgets around. But in the short term, there is quite a lot that can be done, and quite a lot at a local level to actually move the dial forward in active travel, before the budgets change to billions and a road scheme across the Thames or under the Thames is cancelled and another 9 billion becomes available. Unfortunately, a lot of that's hit the culture wars and political objections. But low traffic neighbourhoods are a really cheap intervention. It's a traffic process, some bollards and some consultation and time. They're not capital expensive interventions. And they're a start for people. So if the local authority is saying, we have no funds, there's a list of things that can be started. School streets, 20 MPH interventions, low traffic neighbourhoods, parking restrictions, pedestrianisation. There are long lists of things that don't cost the money, for example, that was spent in London for a protected superhighway on the embankment, which is fantastic, but is a big cost. So there are things that can be started before those budgets are available. I'm not saying that to say we don't want those budgets, but there is no excuse for saying we can't do anything.
Great. Well, we're coming to the end now. I know there are some questions we haven't got to, but perhaps we could carry on the conversation over drinks at the back after the seminar. Just to say, if you've enjoyed the evening, it has been filmed, and all the videos of this seminar and all our past seminars are up on our website, in the public seminar section of our website. So do take a look at the back catalogue of all the seminars that we've held so far. And just a plug for the next one, which is going to be on Wednesday, the 4th of December, which is week 8 of term. And we're going to be talking about health and housing. And so the health impacts of inadequate social housing, and really there's sort of significant impacts that can have on the most disadvantaged in society. So that's going to be a really fascinating evening as well. So do join us. That's Wednesday, the 4th of December. So it just leaves me really to thank the 4 speakers, Kate, Rachel, Hassan and Duncan. Thanks so much for your interventions, your insights, a really fascinating and a great discussion with the audience. So thank you all so much. And thanks for coming, everyone.